Hey guys, tonight we will step through the chilly doors of the Madrid royal palace, where the buried secrets of inbred bloodlines and the tragic marriages of King Ferdinand the Seventh await revelation. Imagine yourself as the royal physician summoned into the cold chambers, standing before the corpse of a monarch who once ruled through fear, and now your duty is not to heal, but to preserve what he spent a lifetime hiding. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you are watching from and what time it is in your local area. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. End of 2. You, the most trusted physician of the Spanish royal court, were summoned to King Ferdinand the Seventh's private chambers immediately after his death, in the year 1834. You stepped through the heavy wooden door, not with the hurried stride of past emergencies, but slowly, as if each footfall required psychological preparation. In that hushed space, only the flicker of a candle illuminated the cold stone floor, causing every sound to echo as though from another era. Unlike any other time, you did not carry your stethoscope, nor your medicine flask or bottles of anesthesia. The Queen Regent, Maria Cristina, your foster mother who had wielded power through 2 decades of Spain's turmoil, sat there with tired but resolute eyes. She silently nodded in greeting, then gestured toward the large bed draped in pristine white linens. Today, her greeting was not, "Please diagnose" or "Please treat," but a single chilling phrase, "Please preserve." You approached, heartbeat slow and steady like a muted drum, acutely aware of the heavy burden of 20 years of unstable, distrustful rule. Ferdinand the Seventh, the king who once instilled fear in his court, was now gone. But that fear remained within the palace walls. Beneath the white cloth, you did not see a hollowed face or cracked lips, but something you could never forget. A grotesquely deformed appendage, so large that historians only whispered about it, never daring to record it in official annals. The dim light revealed a specially crafted cushion placed nearby, its seams finely stitched to support that horrifying part of the body. You recalled the terrible screams echoing down marble corridors on blood-red moonlit nights, when every window was shuttered tight, yet the cries still pierced the walls. Those were nights when Ferdinand summoned his physician for a clinical examination that in truth was torture, when his body could no longer fulfill the role of monarch. Gently, you pulled back the cloth to expose the massive deformity. Your palm trembled as it made contact, as though touching a symbol of profound terror. Beneath the wrinkled skin, you saw taut scars, the remnants of leather and metal implements used in futile efforts to reshape it to the standards of power he believed necessary. In that moment, a torrent of emotions swirled. You remembered the laudanum injections that allowed Maria Antonia and Maria Isabel to endure their wedding nights, and the horror in the eyes of young queens bewildered within the palace's merciless confines. Your knees felt weak, as you realized that today's duty was more than medical. It was the preservation of a terrifying emblem, of an empire built on physical suffering, psychological obsession, and concealed shame. You placed the appendage into the copper tray prepared in advance, carefully wiping away each patch of dried blood before wrapping it securely. Every step you took was meticulously recorded: the date, the hour, the room's temperature, and the sterilized instruments used, all to ensure the body part would not decay or lose the grotesque form that had struck fear into anyone who heard the name Ferdinand the Seventh. Queen Regent Maria Cristina stood silently beside you, her eyes betraying fatigue. You looked at her and understood the weight she bore for the entire kingdom, its stability or collapse now resting in her hands along with the secret you safeguarded. You felt your heart tighten, realizing you had become the guardian of Bourbon dynasty's greatest secret. When the task was complete, you bowed your head in deference, then turned to leave. As the final candle flickered and the door closed behind you, you thought you heard a sigh. Perhaps your own, perhaps the breath of a kingdom slipping into the darkness of memory. Your journey was far from over, but this moment would haunt you for the rest of your days. You may have heard the name Ferdinand the Seventh, but believe me, history is not always confined to battlefields and royal decrees. Today, you will immerse yourself in the life of this king, a monarch whose legacy is both majestic and tragic. Ferdinand the Seventh, born in the year 1784, bore the bloodlines of 2 of Europe's most powerful houses, the Bourbons on his father's side and the Habsburgs on his mother's. His father, King Charles IV, preferred the thrill of the hunt to the intrigues of court, while his mother, Duchess Maria Louisa of Parma, was the granddaughter of Francis I, Holy Roman Emperor, carrying the prestigious Habsburg lineage. Imagine a prince born amid golden halls and luxurious silks, yet from his very first breath, fate granted him no peace. Ferdinand was the second of 10 children born to Charles and Maria Louisa, but only he and a few of his siblings survived to adulthood, a harsh fact reflecting the high infant mortality rate at court. The names of his other siblings, Infanta Maria Isabel, Infante Francisco de Paula, linger only in dusty registers. Most passed away in infancy, leaving a void in the royal family. Your childhood, or rather, Ferdinand's childhood, was far from rosy or carefree. Beneath ornate embroidered garments and candlelit splendor, he underwent rigorous education: foreign languages, decorative painting, court protocol observation, court music, and Spanish etiquette. You might be surprised to learn that Ferdinand spent long hours at his desk, pen in hand. Yet there were few tender memories, for beside him always loomed political crises and the burdens of succession. In the year 1821, when he reached 17 the age, when many princes dream of adventure, Ferdinand ascended the throne, following the forced abdication of Charles IV under Napoleon's pressure. Picture the coronation. Flickering torches casting dancing shadows, the national anthem La Marcha Real echoing through the halls, and the courtiers bowing before the young sovereign. He would reign for 28 years, from 1821 to 1833, presiding over political upheavals that read like the pages of an epic novel. Throughout his reign, Ferdinand VII made undeniable contributions. He restored the Bourbon dynasty after the usurpation by Joseph Bonaparte, Napoleon's brother, who briefly ruled Spain. Under his reign, the Treaty of Vienna in 1822 helped re-establish European stability following the Napoleonic Wars. You can still see his imprint on maps. Territories returned intact and administrative structures gradually reformed after chaos. However, political strategy was not the only story. You also need to listen to the court intrigues. Ferdinand, like many Bourbons before him, was an avid hunter, often neglecting state affairs to roam forests in pursuit of deer. You might wonder, did this pastime undermine his authority, especially as Spain's Latin American colonies rose up for independence? Indeed, during the 1820s, Argentina, Mexico, Peru, and others declared independence, draining the royal treasury. Despite his power and achievements, Ferdinand was haunted by his dynasty's legacy, the stature of his body, the honor of his house, and above all, the need to produce an heir. That anxiety deepened over time, consuming his mind and transforming the ruler into a man desperate to heal a hereditary wound. Can you feel it? A king as grandiose as he was, fragile, harboring dreams of reviving a great empire, yet constantly thwarted by his own bodily limitations. So now you have the broad strokes. Ferdinand VII, a prince born of inbreeding, son of Bourbon and Habsburg, ascending at 17 and reigning for 28 years, restoring Spain after Napoleon yet witnessing colonial collapse. A man who loved hunting and books, fiercely protective of his lineage. But behind that splendor, you will discover a horrifying chronicle of a body that betrayed him, draining not only his strength but his soul. And that is just the beginning of what follows, as you delve deeper into the physical torment and psychological obsessions that no official history dares to fully reveal. The secret of Ferdinand lay not in power or conquest, but in the inbred blood of the Habsburgs and Bourbons. For generations, the Spanish royal family married within its own ranks cousins, uncles and nieces, aunts and nephews. Each union acted as a genetic bomb, spawning mental illness, physical deformities, and wounded souls. Imagine the palace overflowing with ceremony, yet behind silken draperies lay unspoken secrets. Ferdinand was born on the 14th day of October in the year 1784, the only surviving child of King Charles IV and Duchess Maria Louisa of Parma, who themselves were cousins. From his very first breath, his body carried a curse. Whispers about the unusual length and size of his genitalia passed among the wet nurses, then were quietly recorded by the royal physicians. As a child, you might picture Ferdinand running in the palace gardens, but in reality, every step was monitored. The court would not allow him the freedom of ordinary childhood. Beneath the soft candlelight, servants' hushed voices spoke of his abnormality, while physicians spoke in cautious tones. You could almost hear the walls murmur in the draft. The prince is different. Your teenage years, or rather, Ferdinand's unfolded amid secret medical lessons. The royal doctors could no longer pretend that an oversized organ was a mark of greatness. In a society that celebrated perfect proportions according to Greek ideals, this deformity was not honor. It was a stain on dynastic pride. Can you feel it? Every drop of blood in his veins bore centuries of inbred marriages. That blood was thought of as a genetic minefield whenever Ferdinand embodied it. He extended the chain of suffering, carrying mental illness, developmental disorders, and unspoken shame. When Ferdinand entered puberty, early changes were dismissed as late bloom, but soon his body revealed the truth. You recall the physician's secret notes. The prince's organ exceeds normal dimensions, slender at the base, swelling at the tip. Those words appeared on fragile vellum, then were locked away in the royal archives. You listened to the wind whistling through the window frame, as though the walls themselves whispered. The genetic curse burdened not only his flesh but his mind. Despite rigorous education, Ferdinand could not silence his doubts about his own identity. Each time he gazed into a mirror, beneath the glint of his crown lay a mute shame. Can you imagine his sad smile as he wiped sweat from his brow after military drills? Or the distant look in his eyes when courtiers praised the Bourbon bloodline as something to be proud of, while he knew it was his heaviest burden. The court demanded restraint, yet the pain bled into every breath. As he grew older, Ferdinand felt more isolated. You may have heard of his lavish banquets, but few speak of his life inside a velvet-lined bubble. Every pleasure was overshadowed by anxiety that his deformity might be discovered. You wonder, did he ever feel at ease? Or was his life a constant effort to avoid mirrors and the physician's stethoscope? That inbred blood turned his body and mind into an inescapable labyrinth. Each time he mounted his horse for the hunt, he found fleeting freedom only to have the forest breeze carry whispers of disapproving eyes. You could almost hear the prince's heavy sigh, heavier than the weight of the crown itself. And you know that it was this obsession with his body that shaped the man he became, not just a regal sovereign, but a man terrified of his own flesh, always seeking to conceal and mend it. The blood of the Habsburgs and Bourbons gave him a throne, but also an unbreakable curse, inherited shame. Now, as you sit by candlelight, recording the tale of this powerful yet tragic king, you understand that this is only the beginning. The secrets of his inbred lineage will lead you deeper into darkness, where flesh and spirit intertwine in unspoken tragedy. You breathe in deeply, then softly continue on, ready to drift into sleepy slumber alongside mysteries yet unrevealed. According to the secret records of Dr. Francisco Flores, the prince's organ was described as narrow at the base, no wider than a man's thumb, but swelling grotesquely to the size of a fist at the tip, exceeding 10 inches in length at rest and growing even longer when aroused, accompanied by a curvature and clusters of unknown tissue functions. In the gilded halls of the monarchy, size was usually a sign of virility and might, but for Ferdinand it became a waking nightmare. Imagine yourself there, heart heavy, as courtiers lean in to whisper rumors when the prince enters the bathing chamber. You can almost hear the murmur of ambassadors exchanging sly glances, even the jesting laughter of palace pages echoing from marble walls. Each time Ferdinand disrobed, those hushed conversations stained his dignity. The shame was public, a wound no ointment or velvet robe could heal. And yet, Ferdinand refused to bow to that humiliation. Instead, he wielded his authority like a blade, attempting to carve away the memory of his own helplessness. You might see him in your mind's eye, striding through the throne room, cape sweeping the red carpet, eyes blazing with a determination fueled by pain. His edicts became harsher, his punishments more severe. In this way, his private torment forged his public cruelty. As you drift through the corridors with heavy eyelids, consider how the prince's quest for control grew from that very shame. The same voice that whispered, "freak," in the shadows of the palace courts, drove him to tighten his grip on every subject's life. You sense the irony in his attempts. By dominating others, he sought to dominate the one thing he could not control: his own body. Picture the late-night audiences, torchlight flickering against tapestries, as Ferdinand convened secret councils of ministers. Their faces grave, they scrawled decrees under his watchful glare: stricter curfew for nobles, tighter taxes on merchants, increased patrols in city streets. Each order was a ripple of his inner turmoil, a way to prove to himself that power over others might offset his personal powerlessness. In private, you might imagine him retreating to his chambers, the echoes of laughter still clinging to his ears. He would pace the stone floor, rest his palm against the cool surface of a writing desk, and summon his physician once more. The doctor's notes, penned in hushed Latin and Spanish, grew ever more detailed, cataloguing the prince's growth, the curvature, the odd nodules of tissue. Each entry felt like a fresh brand upon Ferdinand's psyche. Yet you, as the observer, sensed the peculiar tragedy. The very instrument of his shame became the reason for endless medical experimentation. Night after night, aides would prepare the thick cushions, line them with silk and leather, apply cooling salves and oils promising relief. The ritual was clinical, impersonal, no tenderness, no warmth, just the cold devotion of a team determined to ease a problem they did not fully understand. And so you watch as Ferdinand dissolved into this cycle. Humiliation, cruelty, medical procedure, and back again to humiliation. It was a feedback loop that sharpened his resolve to control, until no corner of his realm was beyond his reach. You might almost hear his whisper in the dark: "If I cannot master myself, I will master everything else." In those somber nights, you would have seen him glance at his reflection, crown askew, eyes hollow. The weight of that crown must have felt incongruous against the unsteady pulse beneath his robes. You sense his longing for normalcy, something he rarely allowed himself to admit. But admitting it would be to reveal a vulnerability he could not afford. As the palace clock struck midnight, though you rarely saw the clock, mere candles were enough to mark the hours you might find Ferdinand inspecting his ministers' loyalty, asking bluntly who among them had ever dared to laugh at him. Their forced denials only deepened his suspicion. In turn, he replaced them with men chosen more for their obedience than their counsel. In this way, you see how the secret shame documented by Dr. Flores shaped the very fabric of Spanish governance. It was no longer a kingdom guided by reason or compassion, but one governed by a man determined to prove his worth through sheer dominance. The corridors filled with silent fear, and Spain itself seemed to shrink under the weight of its monarch's torment. So you, drifting into drowsiness, trace the path from that private humiliation in Dr. Flores's notes to the public tyranny that followed. Each whisper of silk, each rustle of parchment, becomes a reminder of how devastation at the core of a single man's body can echo outward, shadowing an entire realm. And as your eyes grow heavy, you realize that the tragedy of Ferdinand's deformity was not just personal. It was the hidden engine of a reign etched in fear and sorrow, a story that most would prefer to keep buried in velvet-draped silence. When he reached marriageable age, the royal physicians had to devise a solution for the deformity. Soft padded cushions, supportive devices fashioned from leather and light metals, slippery lubricating oils, soothing salves, and a bewildering array of exotic remedies: rhinoceros, horn powder, pearl dust, rare jungle herbs. You can almost feel the hush of the chamber as these implements were brought out, each one promising a fleeting glimpse of relief. In your mind's eye, you see the courtyard quiet at dusk, servants carrying in trays of silken cushions, apothecary jars clinking like distant chimes. The palace, once a place of ceremonial grandeur, quietly transformed into a strange hybrid of clinic and sexual dungeon. Each attempt at intimacy became a medical intervention. The cushions arranged with clinical precision, the lubricants applied with exacting care, the leather and metal apparatuses adjusted until they fit just so. Then came the injections, just enough anesthetic to dull the edge of pain, but never enough to erase consciousness. You can almost sense the tension in the air as the doctor's hand lingered over the syringe, the patient's breath catching at the bitter scent of laudanum. Yet despite these elaborate contrivances, the physical agony and psychological trauma never truly subsided. You feel the ache of frustration in every detail. The cushion too firm, the oil too cold, the metal contraption a cruel reminder of human artifice. Night after night, the ritual repeated itself, an unending cycle of preparation and procedure, each variation promising hope and delivering disappointment. You can almost hear the soft rustle of silk sheets, the muffled gasps of pain, and the doctor's quiet notations of dosage, of angle, of response. Ferdinand sank deeper into obsession, chasing every rumor of a miraculous cure. You picture him poring over yellowed pamphlets, sealed scrolls in foreign tongues, a mix of alchemical recipes and charlatans' flyers promising to straighten the unnatural, to unlock the womb's fertile power. He ordered tinctures touted as fertility elixirs, tonics claiming to shrink the embarrassing swelling, and elixirs to stabilize the curvature. Each arrived under guard, packed in ivory boxes and carried through deserted corridors by torchlight. Yet each failed utter merciless silence. In the stillness, you detect the palace's collective descent into darkness. The clinking of glass vials echoed like distant bells tolling for a lost hope. Courtiers whispered of midnight supplications, of incense burning in the royal bedchamber, of cryptic ceremonies conjuring ancient remedies that clashed with the principles of medicine. Once proud scholars of the royal court found themselves in hushed debate over the ethics of such treatments, while apothecaries trembled at the thought of mixing powders gathered from distant lands. Through it all, you feel the undercurrent of power and impotence intertwined. The king, sovereign of all Spain, remained powerless over his own body. The same hands that signed decrees of life and death could not rewrite the laws of nature written within his flesh. You imagine him, alone in a low-lit room, discarding leather harnesses in frustration, pressing trembling palms against his face, the echoes of courtly laughter still reverberating behind closed doors. In those moments, the boundary between the palace as seat of power and palace as site of suffering blurred completely. You can almost smell the mingled scents of leather, oil, and sweat, a heady perfume of desperation. And as the candle flames guttered, you sense how the trauma became woven into the fabric of the royal household, seeping into tapestries, staining the marbled floors with the invisible blood of humiliation. With each failed remedy, Ferdinand's hunger for control only deepened. He summoned new teams of physicians and craftsmen, each more specialized than the last. Cushion makers who could shape padding to precise millimeters, metalworkers forging bespoke braces, apothecaries distilling essences from rare roots. The corridors rang with the march of specialists, each convinced they held the key to cure. Yet none succeeded. You might hear their footsteps echoing in your dreams, a relentless parade of false promise. And so the palace remained a crucible of pain and power. The very rituals meant to heal became symbols of shame, fueling a king's cruelty and compelling him to tighten his grip on everything he could command. No part of his realm was left untouched. Taxes rose, punishments hardened, soldiers drilled with merciless rigor. You sense how the private torment became public edict, how the inability to master his own body translated into a ruthless determination to master all others. In the hush before sleep, you drift through these visions. A king pursued by pain, a court enshrouded in secrecy, a nation ruled by a man haunted by his own flesh. The palace's grand tapestries and gilded columns stand in quiet witness, silent chroniclers of a tragedy that no official history dares fully record. And as you let your eyelids grow heavy, you understand that this tragic fusion of medicine and power marks only one stage of the labyrinthine ordeal, one more thread in the tapestry of suffering that defines Ferdinand's reign. In the year 1802, you witness the union of Ferdinand the Seventh and Princess Maria Antonia of Naples, youthful, bright, and innocent. Yet that night, instead of the gentle awakening of love, the palace's finest linens were stained by terror. The air hangs heavy with the scent of laudanum, the anesthetic chosen to obscure pain but not to erode consciousness. You imagine the queen's trembling hand, clutching the hem of her gown as the needle finds her vein, the warm liquid seeping through her veins like a cruel promise of relief. That evening was no tender beginning. It was a cold, surgical ritual. The air hangs heavy with the scent of laudanum, the anesthetic chosen to obscure pain but not to erode consciousness. You imagine the queen's trembling hand, clutching the hem of her gown as the needle finds her vein, the warm liquid seeping through her veins like a cruel promise of relief. That evening was no tender beginning. It was a cold, surgical ritual. You sense the hush that fell over the chamber, broken only by stifled sobs and the soft scratch of a physician's pen recording dosages and reactions. No whispered words of comfort, no gentle guiding hands, only the steady hum of suffering and the measured commands of the medical staff. Maria Antonia, once full of naive hope, became the subject of an unending experiment. In the days that followed, you almost feel her exhaustion settling over the palace like a fog. Each attempt at intimacy transformed into a choreographed procedure. Cushions placed, ointments applied, devices fitted, injections administered, all to fulfill the duty of consummation. You can almost see her closing her eyes in resignation as the salve's cool touch kisses her skin, her breath hitching as the metal support digs in through layers of silk. The first pregnancy brought a glimmer of light, a fragile hope that life might spring from such despair. But in that 4th month, the court doctors quietly acknowledged the inevitable loss. Maria Antonia's body had been ravaged by pain, both physical and emotional. You can feel her heartbreak as she learns of the miscarriage, the hush in the corridors as the news travels by candlelight. Again, she surrenders to the soft sting of laudanum just to bear the grief in a haze. Later, in the final month of another pregnancy, the palace's solemn air deepens into dread. You can almost hear the rustle of silk gowns and the clink of vials as the physicians prepare. Maria Antonia endures a nightmarish labor, the labor that nearly claims her life. The crimson-stained sheets become grim testimony to her suffering, and you sense the tremor in the hands of the midwives as they struggle to save both mother and child. Yet the outcome remains a cruel echo of the first loss. Another miscarriage. More broken bones of hope. By 1807, the Queen's spirit has been ground to dust. Official records state her cause of death as fever, but you know the truth. It was the relentless toll of unending trauma. You picture her final moments, eyes hollow, cheeks sunken, a single weak breath escaping as the court physician pronounces her passing. Maria Antonia, once a beacon of youthful promise, slips away under the guise of natural illness, but in reality she succumbs to exhaustion from ceaseless torment. Ferdinand, unmoved by grief, reacts with cold suspicion. You see him pacing before tapestries, accusing ministers of conspiracies to thwart his quest for an heir. Under his orders, close advisors are interrogated. Whispers of betrayal haunt the corridors. You catch the distant sound of shackles being unlocked, servants summoned for questioning in candlelit halls. The palace, once suffused with ceremonial grace, becomes a crucible of fear and distrust. And then, without hesitation, Ferdinand turns his gaze toward a second bride. You sense the mechanical precision with which marriage negotiations begin. Ambassadors dispatched, dowries debated, pedigrees scrutinized. There is no mourning period, no quiet reflection. Instead, the wheels of royal diplomacy grind on, driven by the same resolve that demands control over a body he cannot command. As you drift toward drowsiness, the image lingers. Maria Antonia's final, fragile smile, the hush of the bedchamber turned surgical theatre, and the king's unflinching determination to replace one broken womb with another. The tragedy is not merely personal, it is emblematic of a reign built on the suffering of those closest to him. And with each failed marriage, the palace sinks deeper into shadows, its grandeur tainted by the silent screams of a princess lost to the merciless machinery of royal duty. After Maria Antonia's death, you might have expected a period of mourning, but in the hush of the palace corridors, the wheels of dynastic necessity turned swiftly. In the year 1816, Ferdinand wed Maria Isabel of Portugal, a 19-year-old princess whose gentle manner and soft laughter seemed to promise reprieve. You can almost imagine her arrival, pale carriage, trembling curtsy, still unaware of the special requirements whispered in the shadows. That very wedding night, the tragedy repeated itself. You hear, faintly, the echoes of her scream carrying through the antechambers and reaching the sentries stationed beyond. In the pale torchlight, you picture the royal bedchamber in disarray by dawn. Gowns strewn across marble floors, the sheets soaked with blood, a once pristine canopy collapsed in chaos. Maria Isabel, though too shocked to scream again, retreated into herself, her laughter silenced, her figure gaunt, her eyes hollowed by dread. Ferdinand could not tolerate what he perceived as her coldness, her unwillingness to embrace the duties he imposed. In his mind, her reluctance equaled defiance. You sense the undercurrent of his wrath as he ordered her correspondence opened, her meals tasted by royal stewards, and her private chambers searched from top to bottom. Each intrusion meant to assert his dominion, to punish perceived insubordination with the banal cruelty of surveillance. But the intrusion did not stop at letters and leftovers. In the heart of the night, you might have found yourself summoned to the Queen's boudoir for one of Ferdinand's private medical conferences. In that strange amphitheatre, the Queen became both patient and prisoner. You see her in a nightdress woven with hidden sensors, wired to contraptions that recorded her heart rate, her temperature, even the slightest tremor in her limbs. She lay upon a sterile frame as the physicians took turns scrutinizing her replies to stimuli each touch, each question, each silent pause logged meticulously in heavy volumes. No comfort was offered. No solace sought, only data points to feed into the king's insatiable quest for control. Sleep eluded her. You almost hear her voice quivering in nocturnal whispers. "A ghost follows me in my dreams," she confided to a lady in waiting, eyes shifting toward shadowy corners as though expecting an apparition. The walls themselves seemed conspirators, closing in with every creak of floorboard. As her restlessness grew, so too did her frailty. By 1818, the court physicians pronounced her dead of nervous exhaustion, a polite fiction for a mind and body battered beyond repair. Yet rumors swirled like dust motes in sunlit halls, that her demise was the inevitable result of relentless physical and mental torment. You imagine the final report filed in the palace archives, the clinical phrase, nerve depletion, masking the truth of nightly intrusions and scientific interrogations. Ferdinand, ever suspicious, would not accept mere coincidence. In his grief-twisted mind, he saw foreign hands in his queen's downfall. You sense the cold authority as he ordered inquiries, convening a tribunal of loyalists to investigate the nurses, the doctors, the very midwives who had attended Maria Isabel's final hours. Accusations flew like arrows in a storm, and several servants found themselves condemned on vague charges of sabotage. And there you stand in the aftermath, footsteps echoing in deserted corridors as the palace sinks deeper into fear. The tragic end of another bride solidified a pattern, one of loss, of suspicion, of control taken to its darkest extreme. Each new investigation, each new decree, only deepened the shadow over the court. The tapestries and chandeliers remained splendid, but the lifeblood of trust had drained away, leaving a kingdom under siege from within. In the flickering candlelight, you feel the weight of it all, a princess's gentle spirit crushed by the demands of a throne, a king whose desire to master everything but his own flesh led him to wrench away the freedom of those he claimed to cherish. The palace, proud under the sun, now lay smothered in the sickly glow of night, its halls heavy with the ghosts of two queens and the ever-present ache of a sovereign's unyielding will. As your eyelids droop and the hush grows thicker, you realize this cycle of tragedy is woven into the very stones, a lullaby of sorrow that no royal decree can ever silence. You, drifting through the hush of another moonlit night in the palace, learn that Ferdinand will not be deterred. Determined to secure an heir by any means, he journeys to the impoverished court of Saxony to woo Princess Maria Josepha Amalia, a 24-year-old noblewoman, whose calm demeanor belies the storm she is about to inherit. Imagine her arrival, a carriage rolling over cobblestones, servants bearing trunks stamped with royal crests, and at her side a retinue of physicians carrying leather satchels brimming with instruments, vials, and tonics. This marriage was no mere alliance of crowns, but a meticulously planned clinical trial. Picture the wedding chamber transformed into a laboratory. You can almost see the ledger that Maria Josepha keeps by her bedside, its pages lined with precise entries. Date and hour of each nocturnal meeting, the angle at which cushions are placed, the brand and viscosity of each lubricating oil, the exact milligrams of anesthetic administered. Each note, written in her own cautious hand, is a data point in Ferdinand's desperate quest for biological success. As you wander the corridors half asleep, you feel the tension radiating from the couple's shared bedchamber. Maria Josepha's analytical composure unnerves the king. He had envisioned a gentle, obedient bride, one who would fulfill his wishes silently. Instead, he finds himself under the quiet scrutiny of his new wife's pen. You sense his fury as he orders the searching of her dispatches, the rifling of her trunks, and the questioning of her attendants. He suspects her of espionage, of cataloguing his vulnerabilities for foreign spies. The walls of the palace, once echoing with music and laughter, now seem to close in, trapping every soul in a web of perpetual vigilance. Yet even with science on his side, the outcomes remain elusive. After several cycles of painstaking procedures, arranged cushions, warmed salves, measured doses of sedative, the attempt to produce a successor fails time and again. By the year 1823, having endured countless nights of regimented intimacy recorded in her notebook, Maria Josepha reaches her limit. You almost hear the rustle of her silk robe as she retreats, closing the door to her chamber with finality. No longer patient or curious, she refuses to continue the experiments. She moves into the adjacent apartments, leaving Ferdinand alone with his obsessions. In the silence that follows, you can imagine him seated at his desk, candle flame dancing across his stern features as he pores over the blank pages of her journal pages, once brimming with data, now vacant like his hopes for an heir. The court physicians, hitherto summoned nightly, stand idle in the antechamber, their instruments untouched. The palace drifts in an uncanny lull. The hush of disuse hangs heavier than any fear. Throughout these years, you sense a foundational shift. The king's need for control has metastasized from his body to the very realm he governs. As his wives depart from the grand marital bedchamber, first Maria Antonia, then Maria Isabel, now Maria Josepha, so too do fragments of his humanity. You might almost hear his low mutter, as the echoes of her refusal settle in the halls. If I cannot command her flesh, I must command her silence. In that quiet, the palace staff grows restless. The guards exchange furtive glances as they pass Maria Josepha's silent door. The ladies in waiting tread lightly, uncertain whether to greet their queen or avert their gaze. And you, drifting through these half-lit corridors, feel the weight of a monarch's unyielding will pressing on every stone and tapestry. And so, as your eyelids droop and the hush deepens, you realize that this chapter, this third attempt at conjugal science, has collapsed under its own precision. Ferdinand remains a ruler without an heir, his triumphs in statecraft overshadowed by the void at the heart of his lineage. Maria Josepha's departure marks not a reprieve, but a new stage of isolation. The king, now more alone than ever, left only with his calculations and his ever-present dread that the next bride, like the last, will become yet another unwilling participant in an experiment that can never succeed. In this stillness, you sense the palace itself holding its breath, awaiting the next move in this tragic saga. And as you drift into slumber, you carry with you the echo of her final steps, soft, determined, and irrevocable, reverberating down the empty halls of a kingdom built on secrets and unfulfilled promises. Spain reeled under political turmoil, yet you sense Ferdinand's single-minded hunger for a royal heir remained undiminished. In the year 1830, he wed Maria Cristina of Naples, a princess already bearing a child not sired by him. The court brimmed with whispered speculation, but to Ferdinand it mattered little. What he demanded was an heir, legitimate or otherwise. You can almost feel the hush that fell over the grand cathedral as Maria Cristina arrived, her silhouette framed by incense smoke and flickering lanterns. No anxious glance at her swelling belly slowed the procession. Instead, trumpets blared a victory fanfare to herald the future monarchy. You imagine the noble families lining the aisles, bowing with forced smiles, aware that their new queen carried someone else's promise within her. Yet behind the pageantry, Ferdinand saw only potential, the continuation of his line, the triumph of his imperious will. When the child Isabella was born, the nation exhaled in joyous relief. Bells pealed across plazas, merchants lowered taxes for a day, and church choirs raised hallelujahs at dawn. The streets overflowed with tricolour flags unfurled in celebration of a princess who, for a few fleeting moments, embodied hope for a fractured kingdom. But that hope was fragile, for Ferdinand's doubts gnawed at him like restless mice. You sense his watchful gaze even in sleep. Concealed peepholes drilled in the nursery walls, tiny apertures through which he observed the queen as she cradled the infant against her breast. You might almost hear the soft click of the hidden shutters opening and closing, each sound a reminder that trust had no place here. In his private chambers, the king kept death masks of his former wives, Maria Antonia, Maria Isabel, Maria Josefa, arranged on a velvet-lined shelf like a morbid gallery. You picture their pale faces staring back at him through the gloom, silent testaments to his failures. Now, he placed them in his new queen's room, a grim vigil to ensure that Isabella's cries were truly those of his own blood. No toy in the palace was spared his scrutiny. You envision Maria Christina's gentle hands presenting a wooden horse to her daughter, only to have the princess's playthings swept into a marbled antechamber for examination. Every doll, every silk ribbon, every piece of miniature furniture was turned over under gleaming silver lamps. Searched for hidden clues, perhaps a coded letter from Naples, perhaps a stain of foreign soil. Isabella, too young to understand, would tug at her mother's skirts, sensing the absence of warmth, the unnatural chill of a nursery that resembled a glass cage more than a cradle. The palace itself seemed to contract around them. Corridors once echoing with music and laughter now felt narrower, as if the stone walls drew inward at each step you took. You might hear the scuff of boots that patrolled the private apartments, the low murmur of servants ordered to report every glance exchanged between queen and child. No room was private, no moment unobserved. In those quiet hours, you could almost hear Maria Christina's sighs as she rocked Isabella to sleep. Her lullabies, a soft Neapolitan melody, floated through the hush, a fragile thread of motherly devotion in a tapestry of suspicion. But even these melodies were interrupted by the subtle click of hidden doors, the faint whir of concealed mechanisms triggered by a monarch's paranoia. As Isabella grew, her wide eyes so full of wonder would scan the carved high chair at mealtime, never settling on her mother without glancing first toward the hidden vantage points. You sensed the child's confusion, the early shaping of her instincts. Never fully at ease, always attuned to the shifting shadows. Throughout the day, the courtiers whispered behind silk fans, "The queen lives in a gilded prison." They spoke of Maria Christina's pale cheeks and downcast gaze, of Isabella's restless nights haunted by unseen watchers. Yet no one dared confront the king. His orders were absolute, his suspicions unassailable. You, drifting through these memories, feel the weight of their shared captivity. The very tapestries depicting triumphal scenes now seem to mock them, vivid battlefields of colour framing a mother and child held hostage by doubt. Fernando's legacy of control had reached its most intimate frontier. He would not allow even the bond between mother and daughter to escape his scrutiny. In this sombre realm, you perceive how power warps the most sacred ties. The bond meant to bloom between Maria Christina and Isabella withered under the glare of clandestine eyes. Each tender embrace was met with clandestine surveillance, each whispered lullaby recorded by invisible sentries. And you, drifting towards sleep, grasped the tragedy. A royal line preserved at the cost of a mother's peace and a child's innocence. In a palace that had become a crystalline cage, brilliant yet unforgiving, you can feel the tremor in the very stones of the palace as Spain convulses in revolt. The streets beyond the thick walls echo with the cries of the discontented farmers, artisans, even soldiers clashing in ragged skirmishes. Yet within the gilded corridors, you witness a different kind of uprising. Ferdinand has plunged headlong into a labyrinth of his own making, one woven from paranoia and pain. You notice first the absence of appetite. The king who once feasted on grand banquets now pushes aside platters of roast and fruit, leaving only the garnish untouched. In the lamplit night, you might see him perched on a stool near the hearth, picking at stale bread while his counsellors linger in hushed fear at the doorway. His sleep is riddled with fits and starts. One moment he lies still, like a silent statue. The next, he bolts upright, muttering disconnected fragments of commands and accusations. You imagine the echo of his footsteps in the empty hall outside Maria Christina's chambers, searching for comfort that never comes. The court itself has fallen silent. Laughter and music have fled the ballrooms and salons, replaced by a hush so profound it feels alive. You hear the soft rustle of silk as noble women whisper among themselves, worry etched into their voices. Ministers stand before the throne with rigid composure, each careful to mask the tremor in his hand as he presents fresh reports of unrest in the provinces. All eyes turn to the king, hoping against hope for guidance, but find only a figure crumpled under the weight of his own mind. Each time Ferdinand encounters Maria Christina, you observe a grim ritual. She arrives for her morning audience, gown swishing softly against marble, and he inspects her with cold precision. You see the court physicians hovering at his elbow, ready to examine the queen's skin, measure her pulse, and declare whether she is pure enough for royal proximity. You feel the tension spike as they record her every vital sign, then deliver a terse report. Her health is sound, her person remains uncontaminated. Only then will the king permit a brief exchange, a curt nod, a word or two before ushering her away. Beyond these examinations, Ferdinand's demands extend to the very air they breathe. You might glimpse him in the palace kitchens, striding among terrified cooks, demanding daily analyses of food and water. He insists on reports about the purity of the breeze that drifts through the windows, that no foreign rancor, no malign influence may taint his queen or his child. In the larder, jars of pickled vegetables and cured meats sit under the scrutinizing gaze of apothecaries, who taste sample each morsel before it may be served. You almost hear the clink of glass beakers and the sighs of the cooks as they hurry to comply. This relentless scrutiny drives many palace servants to collapse from sheer exhaustion. You are called in to assist when a footman faints mid-step, his face ashen, eyes rolling back. A chambermaid keels over while shaking out Maria Christina's skirts. A page staggers and grips the banister for support. You bind their wrists with cloth, whisper soothing words, and carry them to beds prepared with equal care, fresh linens, prescribed medicines, and restorative broths guaranteed free of toxins. Yet no remedy can heal the deeper wound, the ceaseless tension of living under a monarch's watchful dread. Then, on the 29th day of September in the year 1833, you stand in the antechamber as news arrives. The official pronouncement is that the king has succumbed to a severe bout of gout, its ravages intensified by years of neglect and stress. But you and the court know better. The true cause lies in the intersection of physical disease and the ceaseless torment of his psyche. The body that once bore the burdens of a kingdom could no longer sustain the mind consumed by shame and suspicion. In the hush that follows, you glimpse the hollows etched into the faces of those nearest to him. Maria Christina, so often subjected to examinations and edicts, weeps quietly behind a silk fan. The physicians lower their heads, reluctant to meet your gaze. And the courtiers shift uncomfortably, realizing that the crown they once revered now rests on an empty cushion. You step out into the courtyard, where the breeze carries a distant rumble of discontent. The people of Spain, hungry and disillusioned, have little reason to mourn a king who lost sight of their welfare. Streets once lined with banners of triumph now hang tattered and faded. Inns echo with the news of his passing, and tavern keepers pour extra wine for travellers who toast to the end of an era marked by fear. Yet you feel the sting of loss, not only for the man who lay dying in his bedchamber, but for the dream he once embodied, a unified Spain under Bourbon rule. That dream lies shattered, a mosaic of broken promises and wounded hearts. The palace, stripped of its laughter and song, seems to hold its breath for what comes next. A regency, a new monarch, or perhaps the crumbling of a dynasty. As night deepens and the candles gutter low, you walk through silent halls one last time. You pass the death masks of Ferdinand's wives, Maria Antonia, Maria Isabel, Maria Josepha, each now a pale witness to the tragedy of their shared fate. You imagine his spirit rising from the bed where he took his last breath, wandering through the rooms that once echoed with his commands, now still as stone. And as you prepare to rest, you carry the weight of a kingdom in flux, a court emptied of mirth, a people burdened by revolution, and the memory of a king undone by the very secrets he strove to preserve. In the quiet darkness, you drift towards sleep, the pulse of history beating softly around you, promising that the next chapter will be written by those brave enough to dream beyond the shadows he left behind. After Ferdinand VII drew his final breath, you and your fellow physicians faced a task unlike any other: the preservation of that grotesque organ which had come to define his reign. The royal bedchamber was hushed as we prepared. A copper tray, polished to a dull gleam, lay ready on a mahogany table. Leather straps, silk cloths, and glass jars were arranged with clinical precision. You can almost feel the weight of the moment, thick as the candle smoke curling toward the ceiling. First, we administered a potent arterial injection, intended to halt the onset of decay. The needles glinted in the dim light as they pierced the flesh, and the cold fluid spread through the tissue like a silent promise of stasis. You may recall the sensation of dampness under your fingertips as you gently massaged the solution into every crevice. The king's hand lay still, a faded glove thrown aside, a final relic of his tortured humanity. Next came the drying process. Layers of desiccating powders, arsenic compounds, botanical resins, and finely ground charcoal were packed around the organ, drawing out moisture over nights of vigil. Each evening you would enter the chamber to stoke the embers in the brazier, ensuring that dryness prevailed. The hiss of heated air and the soft shifting of drying salts became the soundtrack to our work, punctuating the silence with echoes of inevitability. Once fully dried, the organ was wrapped meticulously in linen, soaked in a preserving balm, its soft fibers stained amber by the alchemical concoction. You remember how the cloth clung to every contour, outlining the grotesque silhouette even under layers of gauze. Then came the sealing. Beeswax-coated parchment bearing the royal seal, pressed firmly to secure the wrappings. The seal itself was a cold weight, its embossed Bourbon crest, a stark reminder of the power once wielded by the man beneath. At last, the vessel for transport arrived. A lead-lined oak chest, gilded plates hammered to display the Vatican's crest, and the date of interment. You watched as your colleagues lifted the chest, the organs swaddled within, and carried it out through corridors now hushed with reverence and dread. The echo of their footsteps receded, until only the flicker of torches remained, dancing against tapestries that had witnessed decades of joy and sorrow. As the chest journeyed to its secret resting place in the archives of Vatican City, you felt the weight of its symbolism settle in your bones. This was no mere anatomical curiosity. It was a testament to a royal tragedy. Power had proven helpless in the face of a body's betrayal. A monarch's shame, once buried beneath crown and cloak, now found its immortal witness in wax, linen, and lead. The organ became a silent orator, speaking volumes of obsession, humiliation, and the limits of privilege. History would remember Ferdinand the Seventh not for the battles he won or the laws he passed, but for the torture of his own flesh and soul. His reign became a cautionary tale. When shame sits upon the throne alongside authority, personal agony can ignite a conflagration that consumes more than an individual. It can engulf a dynasty, scorch a kingdom's spirit, and leave it trembling in the ashes of its own grandeur. In the hush, after the last candle guttered out, the palace exhaled a breath it had held for decades. Where once the clatter of embroidery needles and the murmur of court gossip thrived, now only memories lingered, spectres of triumph and trauma intertwined. You, drifting between wakefulness and sleep, knew that this final relic, secreted away in Vatican vaults, would outlive stone and silver, outlast every decree and every war, standing as a grotesque monument to a sovereign undone by his own cursed anatomy. And as you close your eyes, the final image that flits behind your lids is that leaden chest, buried in silent darkness, containing the most bizarre vestige of a king who ruled through fear and left behind a legacy of sorrow. In that final silence, the echo of his tragedy resonates still. A reminder that even crowns cannot mend the fractures of flesh, and that the deepest wounds often lie hidden, waiting to shape destinies long after the sovereign's voice has faded into history's hush. In the year 1829, you sense a rare flicker of hope stirring within the palace walls. After the heartbreak of 2 failed marriages, Maria Josepha Amalia, your third queen, bears the promise of new life. Whispers swirl through the corridors. At last, an heir may be born, securing the Bourbon legacy. Immediately, Ferdinand orders every precaution. Elite guards, chosen for their unwavering loyalty, form a silent ring around the birthing chamber. Each platter in the royal kitchens is tested for poison, small samples carried off under torchlight to be examined by trusted apothecaries. Even the very air must remain absolutely pure, so perfumed candles burn day and night to mask any taint, and windows are sealed against the outside world. You can almost see the shudder of relief pass through the court, as Maria Josepha's belly swells a living symbol of the king's enduring power. Processions halt, music softens, and courtiers bow deeper. In the hush of the palace, candles flicker as monks are summoned to chant prayers in echoing halls, their hymns weaving through archways as a plea to safeguard mother and child. Yet beneath the reverent tones lies a current of tension. Every footstep measured, every breath held in expectation. Then, in the 7th month, calamity strikes. A grim hush falls when the rupture of the placenta is discovered, a common but often fatal complication in those days. Panic seeps into the bedchamber. You watch as Maria Josepha's face pales, as her attendants rush to her side. In the chamber beyond, Ferdinand stands rigid, eyes blazing with a mixture of fear and fury. He rejects the counsel of seasoned physicians, convinced that conventional medicine cannot save his family or his line. Instead, he summons folk healers, astrologers, and alchemists. At midnight, you hear the crackle of strange fires in hidden rooms, the scent of incense choking the corridors. Latin verses mix with whispered invocations to unseen spirits. You imagine Maria Josepha lying on a bier of velvet cushions, her hair damp with sweat, as hooded figures circle, scattering powders of unknown origin. Hushed rituals, meant to channel divine intervention, only deepen the gloom, turning solemn chambers into theatres of arcane desperation. You feel the thrum of dread as the queen labours in agony. The king kneels by her side, issuing frantic instructions to his physician. Apply heat, no, cool the limb. Administer the wine tincture, no, the distilled essence. You sense his desperation as the syringe pierces her vein again and again, each injection a gamble between relief and ruin. The midwives, faces drawn, work by the flicker of lanterns, their practiced hands stained with both hope and dread. At long last, a child arrives into the world, but life flickers only briefly. You catch the hush as the babe draws a single, gossamer breath before succumbing to infection. In that moment, the candlelight seems to dim, and the palace holds its fractured breath. Maria Josepha, stricken by grief and physical ruin, weakens further. 3 weeks later, in an empty chapel hung with mourning drapes, she draws her last, fragile breath. Officially, they declare her death to be puerperal fever, childbed fever. In polite terms, but you know the truth lies in a tapestry of trauma, the cumulative toll of forced ceremonies and denied medical care. Ferdinand does not pause to mourn. Instead, his suspicion blooms into accusation. He orders inquiries into the birthing team, demanding that any nurse or physician found culpable be punished as traitors. You might glimpse the flash of terror in a midwife's eyes as she is summoned, trembling before the royal tribunal. Their whispered confessions, wrung from fear and fatigue, become fuel for the king's relentless drive for retribution. This tragedy cuts deeper than any blade. It confirms to Ferdinand that life itself is a mechanism of power, one he believes he must control utterly. The mother's collapse and the child's death become a crucible in which his vision of sovereignty is reforged. He can no longer see himself as merely a ruler. He becomes an arbiter of life and death. You sense the walls of his mind narrowing into a tunnel of obsession, where the next marriage is not a union of hearts but a clinical trial to be conducted under his absolute will. As you drift past torchlit corridors haunted by memories of grief, you feel the palace's heartbeat slow under the weight of this cruel lesson. The echoes of Maria Josepha's final cries still vibrate through tapestry and stone, a reminder that even royal privilege cannot elude human frailty. The palace, once bright with hope, now leans into shadow, awaiting the next bride who must step into the king's labyrinth of demands and doubts, her own fate woven into the tragic tapestry of power and pain. In the year 1830, you witness Ferdinand VII arranging his fourth marriage, this time to Maria Cristina of Naples, a princess who arrived in Madrid, already bearing a child not of his blood. You sense immediately that this union is less a matter of the heart and more a chess move on Europe's diplomatic board. Under torchlight and crimson draperies, vows were exchanged with little passion, the promise of an heir trumpeting louder than any love between bride and groom. When Princess Isabella finally opened her eyes to the world, the court breathed a collective sigh of relief. For Spain, she became the living emblem of renewed hope. A tiny monarch draped in silk, her golden curls a beacon in troubled times. Yet for Ferdinand, Isabella was never simply a daughter. She was the greatest challenge he had ever faced. Every heartbeat of hers echoed in his mind, a test of his ultimate power over life and blood. He could not let go of paternity's shadow. You, walking the silent halls at dawn, might glimpse the so-called watcher's holes that he installed, tiny apertures drilled into nursery walls, hidden behind ornate tapestries. Through these pinpricks in the marble, Ferdinand observed each tender gesture, the way Maria Christina's arms cradled the infant, the soft murmur of lullabies, the Queen's solemn prayers at the child's bedside. It was as though the palace itself had become a cage of glass, in which no mother-child moment went unseen. No toy was safe from the king's suspicion. You see the royal playroom emptied day after day, as court servants carted away every wooden horse, every music box, to be searched for hidden messages or poisons. Isabella's clothes underwent the same scrutiny. Embroidered frocks laid out under daylight lamps, each stitch inspected for foreign fibres. Even the porcelain doll she clung to was disassembled piece by piece, its eyes, arms and sewn seams examined under a magnifying glass for any trace of treachery. Under this relentless surveillance, Maria Christina's spirit began to wither. In her letters home to Naples, you might almost hear her weary pen describe life as a prisoner in a gilded cage, each breath recorded, each heartbeat monitored, until she scarcely recognized the woman she once was. Foreign envoys, once eager to strengthen ties with Spain, now found themselves hesitating at the palace gates, unsettled by rumors of an unstable court. Marital negotiations with other royal houses faltered, and whispers of isolating Spain from continental politics began to surface. Meanwhile, the common people of Spain, burdened by heavy taxes and political unrest, watched with growing unease as the king poured treasure into private guards, hidden chambers, and exotic surveillance devices, funds that might have improved roads, fields, or harbours. You, drifting through these thoughts, might imagine the farmers in Andalusia murmuring at midday, or merchants in Barcelona shaking their heads, as they paid yet another levy to fill the royal coffers for devices no one understood. Despite the oppressive atmosphere, Princess Isabella thrived in her fragile way. You picture her curious eyes drinking in the world, her small hand reaching for ribbons of sunlight that filtered through the latticed windows. Yet even her simplest gesture, leaning toward her mother, was subject to medical examination. Before each motherly embrace, physicians would measure Isabella's temperature, listen to her chest, note her pulse, then allow Maria Cristina a brief moment to hold her child before whisking her away for another round of tests. The Queen and Princess became living relics of the palace's anxiety, displayed and examined rather than embraced. Memory formed in uneasy layers. The weight of a doctor's hand on a child's back, the rustle of examination gowns in midnight corridors, the echo of a nurse's discreet sob as she prepared yet another thermometer. You sense how this procedure forged a bond of shared sorrow between mother and daughter, one that held no warmth, only a vigil of unspoken grief. Still, Isabella endured. You feel the fragile hope that accompanied her first unsteady steps, the tiny footfalls barely audible over the hush of marble halls. Her survival against the relentless tide of scrutiny made her a symbol, both of Spain's future and of its past tragedies. Courtiers began to draw comparisons between this living child and the spectral memories of queens lost: Maria Antonia, Maria Isabel, Maria Josepha, each voice now silent, each face a memory preserved only in death masks. For Ferdinand, Isabella's very existence became a mirror of his own contradictions, pride in a legacy secured, and yet an unshakable dread that he might lose her as he had lost those before. You almost see him standing at the nursery doorway, eyes flickering between joy and torment, envisioning a dynasty restored even as he trembles at the thought of another betrayal by fate. In this subdued palace of velvet and shadows, the tragedy deepens. Isabella is the promise of a stable lineage, yet also the living reminder of all that has gone wrong. Under the veneer of celebration, you feel the pulse of a kingdom caught between hope and fear, between the love of a father and the unyielding demands of a monarch's doubt. And as your eyelids grow heavy and the hush envelopes you once more, you carry the weight of a story turned lullaby, a princess who survived, a queen who mourned, and a king whose power could never soothe the wounds he himself had inflicted. As Princess Isabella grew into her early years, the palace itself seemed to tremble with unease. You, drifting through the corridors at dawn, would pass whispering nobles clutching urgent letters from French and British envoys. Their words were stark. King Ferdinand's instability poses a political threat. Meanwhile, beyond the palace gates, Spain's economy faltered, and the New World colonies one by one declared independence. Yet none of these crises drew the king's attention. Rather than tending to the suffering of his realm, he poured gold into a vast network of spies. Agents prowled the streets and prowled the halls, ready to report any hint of dissent among ministers or courtiers. Night after night, elite guards surrounded the private apartments of Queen Maria Christina and young Isabella. No one, neither lady-in-waiting nor visiting diplomat, entered without weapon checks and identity papers. You might see a noble halt mid-step, bowed head tilted as a guard's gauntleted finger indicated a search. Torches gleamed against steel breastplates, and shadows danced on the marble walls, giving the palace an air more of fortress than royal residence. Ferdinand did not stop there. He convened secret hearings deep within the royal archives, summoning high-ranking officials to swear undying loyalty in ink. The hush of the archives overshadowed the clack of quills, as each minister signed a parchment pledging fealty. Any slip a trembling hand, a faltering signature was declared treason. You may imagine the panic that followed as names disappeared from the roster. Some exiled to distant provinces, others simply vanished without record. The court became a labyrinth of suspicion, each corner echoing with the question, who will be next? In this atmosphere, even Isabella, scarcely 7 years old, felt the chill. You might glimpse her tiny figure peeking around a marble column as soldiers marched by her nursery door, their boots ringing like distant thunder. She heard the soft murmur of courtiers debating the fate of their peers. Will she be accused? Will he be sent away? Fear seeped into her child's heart, and you understood that growing up under such scrutiny would cast a long shadow over her future reign. During this time, Ferdinand's obsession with his own deformity did not wane. He hosted what he called medical symposiums within the palace walls, inviting doctors and anatomists from across Europe. Imagine grand halls filled with dusty tomes, the air heavy with the scent of formaldehyde and candle wax. Physicians leaned over crude ink sketches of his anatomy, suggesting new supports cushions carved from exotic woods, harnesses lined with leather, intricate metal braces shaped by specialized blacksmiths. You, lounging in the gallery behind velvet curtains, would see professors nodding solemnly as they examined the king's self-portraits of pain. These gatherings bolstered Ferdinand's view of himself as a rare case, a living curiosity for medical science. Yet you could sense the ripple of contempt that these events sent through the populace. Rather than focusing on famine-stricken provinces or rebellious colonies, the sovereign's attention was fixed on a personal affliction. Rumors spread among townspeople. The king cares more for his own body than for our fields. Each new device, each drawn anatomical diagram, eroded the monarchy's prestige in the public eye. And so the palace, once resplendent with courtly pageants, became a claustrophobic cage. You might hear the distant clatter of a dismissed soldier's armor as he was sent to guard a remote hallway, or the soft sigh of an exiled minister as he passed through an unmarked door. Meanwhile, prints and pamphlets reached the taverns, satirical sketches of a king hunched over his anatomical atlas, quill in hand, while Spain burned in rebellion. By candlelight, villagers chuckled nervously, trading tales of a monarch more concerned with his own flesh than his kingdom's future. Through it all, Isabella watched from her gilded crib. You might see her pale reflection in a silver mirror, wide eyes tracking the shadowy figures who paced nearby. No lullaby soothed her. No lull of royal opulence could mask the tension that threaded through every tapestry. She learned early that power could warp love and fear, could eclipse joy. And you, lulled by the hush of history, would realize that this girl raised in glass-like surveillance and overshadowed by her father's obsessions was destined to inherit a realm fractured by his own vanity and doubt. As your eyelids grow heavy, you carry with you the image of a lonely child in a grand palace, where the echoes of political unrest and medical voyeurism intertwined. The tapestry of her early years, woven from fear and fascination, set the tone for a reign that would follow one born from the tragic shadow of a king who lost sight of everything but himself. By the year 1832, you can sense Ferdinand's health unraveling before your very eyes. Once a robust monarch whose presence filled the throne room with authority, he now refuses dinner, his appetite vanished as though swallowed by his own anxieties. In the hushed corridors, court physicians whisper that his speech has grown slurred, syllables stumbling over one another like tired soldiers on parade. His skin takes on a pallid hue, veins standing out like tangled roots, and his hands tremble whenever he lifts a goblet or grasps a document. You imagine him seated in a dimly lit chamber, torso hunched beneath velvet robes, eyes darting as he struggles to form coherent thoughts. His mind drifts between guilt-laden hallucinations and a desperate urge to atone by overseeing every breath Maria Cristina and Isabella take. You sense the wild tug at his thoughts. If he cannot master his own flesh, perhaps total surveillance will redeem him. Royal princes and ministers, once unwavering in their fealty, grow uneasy. Whispers of escape ripple through the court, some choosing to seek refuge abroad, rather than risk becoming the next target of the king's suspicions. Outside the palace walls, commoners murmur of a court gone mad, and the very air seems heavy with foreboding. Finally, on the 29th day of September, 1833, Ferdinand the Seventh's restless night reaches its end. The official bulletin proclaims his passing was caused by chronic gout, a polite euphemism for a body worn down by neglect and stress. Yet you and the inner circle know the truth. It was the fatal intersection of bodily disease and relentless psychological torment. When the news spreads, the palace is plunged into stunned silence. Maria Cristina weeps softly against her chamber walls, and ministers lower their heads, powerless to reverse the damage. A few days later, under the shroud of secrecy, the royal physicians undertake their final grim commission. In a silent ritual, they retrieve the organ that had haunted Ferdinand's life, a grotesque emblem of his shame and power. You picture the chamber flickering with torchlight as they lay it on a copper tray. The men work methodically, wrapping it in ceremonial linen soaked in preserving dyes, sealing it in a custom-made box of polished oak, its brass hinges clicking shut like the heart of a tomb. A parchment bearing the king's final command is affixed with royal seal, its wax warmed by the last flickers of candle flame. That evening, you join the covert procession out of the palace. Beneath the cloak of darkness, a silent contingent carries the discreet chest to a waiting carriage, its panels unmarked, except for the faint outline of the seal. You feel the tension in every step as the carriage wheels roll over cobblestones, the silence broken only by the muffled clip-clop of hooves and the rustle of robes. Rumours ignite almost instantly. Whispers of a dark secret bound for Rome, murmurs of a relic too horrifying for public scrutiny. Upon arrival in Vatican City, the vault-like archive doors swing open for the chest's reception. You note the austere faces of those privileged few Vatican officials sworn to absolute discretion as they escort the box to its underground chamber. The heavy gates close with a resonant clang, sealing the organ away in twilight gloom. Only the handful of privileged clergy and curators ever glimpse its shape, a silent testimony to a sovereign's failure to heal his own flesh, and the monstrous legacy of a life lived in fear. That preserved relic becomes more than a medical curiosity. It stands as a monument to personal and national tragedy. Ferdinand had wielded authority over armies and treaties, yet he could not conquer the malady that lay within. His mind's labyrinth of suspicion led to a reign marked by rigidity and despair, dragging Spain into one crisis after another. And now, that small wax-sealed box in a secret Vatican vault holds the final, haunting echo of his tyranny over both body and realm. In the days that follow, the court dispels its fears outward, lavishing attention on the mechanics of succession. But you, drifting through memories in the twilight hush, recall the jagged fracture between crown and compassion. The king's grand ambitions, his political maneuvers, they all seem dwarfed by the singular image of that preserved organ, an eternal cipher of shame, obsession, and the ultimate collapse of power when a ruler cannot even master his own mortality. In the silent aftermath of Ferdinand the Seventh's passing, public opinion fractured like old porcelain. In one corner, sympathetic voices spoke of him as a victim of dynastic fate, a hapless heir burdened by the sins of his forebears. They lamented the cruel legacy of inbreeding, the relentless pressure to produce an heir, the psychological torment that marred his reign. Yet in another corner, harsh critics thundered that he embodied the sickness of power, a monarch whose own body became a prison and whose obsessions poisoned the body politic. You might have caught wind of these debates drifting across Europe's salons and coffeehouses. In Paris, aristocrats muttered about the tragic king who could not master his flesh, debating whether genetics or madness had won his final victory. In London, scholars penned essays on the perils of royal consanguinity, citing Spain's ordeal as a cautionary example. Even in distant Vienna and Berlin, Lecture halls buzzed with hushed references to the monarch, who turned his bedchamber into a theatre of horrors, a microcosm of a failing nation. Back in Spain, the Bourbon dynasty's hold unspooled rapidly. Revolts ignited in provincial towns, embers of discontent fanned by a faltering economy. Treasury vaults, once brimming with silver coins from colonial trade, lay half empty as tax revenues dried up. And two great stretches of the empire, Chile and Peru, Venezuela and Mexico, slipped through Spain's fingers, declaring independence one after another. The map shrank with each bold pronouncement, as if the world itself had turned its back on the old regime. Into this embattled realm stepped Princess Isabella, the young successor whose very birth had sparked hope. Yet her coronation took place beneath a pall of suffering. You can almost picture the solemn ceremony. Paris, green banners folded back, a sparse throng of nobles half-heartedly applauding, the air thick with unease. Isabella, clad in the finest silks, should have been the symbol of renewal. Instead, she inherited a kingdom hobbled by debt, divided by distrust, and haunted by the memory of her father's tragedies. The court could not remain unchanged. Reformers, emboldened by calls for modern governance, pressed for a constitutional order. You may have heard the murmur of quills, scratching as parliamentary sessions opened in Madrid, lawyers debating charters, ministers pledging allegiance to a new framework that limited royal prerogative. Yet even as statutes were drafted and oaths exchanged, the scars of Ferdinand's reign ran deep. The people's wounds were not so easily healed by ink and parchment. For every page of reforms, there lingered a patient scar. For every clause guaranteeing rights, there echoed the memory of a king who denied even his closest kin the simplest comforts. In remote villages, priests preached forgiveness yet spoke in undertones of betrayal. In dockside taverns, fishermen toasted to freedom while children shivered through winter nights broken by soldiers' boots. The nation's heart beat, but its pulse was faint, a tremor of hope weighed down by grief. Through this all, history whispered its warning. Ferdinand's story, his obsession with a body he could never master, his use of power to quell personal shame became emblematic of monarchy's peril. It showed how the cruelties inflicted in private chambers could echo outward, ravaging public life and destabilizing empires. Power unchecked by empathy, you recognized, is like fire without water. It consumes indiscriminately, leaving naught but ashes. Yet in the gloom, you also sensed the flicker of human resilience. Isabella, growing into her role, sought to temper authority with compassion. You might catch her reading petitions by candlelight, reaching out to famine-stricken villagers, or listening patiently to ministers' pleas for relief. In her measured grace, you saw the promise of a new era, one born not of secrets and surveillance, but of healing and humanity. And as you, heavy-eyed and near sleep, reflect on these events, you grasp the enduring lesson. A kingdom may rise on the strength of lineage, but it survives only through the bonds of compassion. When personal shame is crowned alongside royal power, it can ravage not just one man, but an entire nation. In the end, the tragedy of Ferdinand VII stands as a timeless admonition that the limits of authority are bound by the fragility of the human heart, and that true strength lies in understanding those wounds, not in burying them in silence. As you drift away from tonight's journey into the dimly lit corridors of Ferdinand VII's court, you carry more than just a compelling story. You bring home a mirror to examine our own lives. Through the lens of a monarch consumed by bodily shame and unrelenting suspicion, you witness how unchecked power can magnify private suffering into public crisis. By tracing Ferdinand's descent, his desperate medical interventions, his surveillance of loved ones, and the ultimate collapse of his dynasty, you gain a deeper appreciation for the delicate balance between authority and empathy. What, then, do you take with you from this tale? First, you recognize the importance of compassion in leadership. Ferdinand's tragedies were fueled by his inability to place trust in others or to show kindness to himself. In your modern context, whether at work, within your family, or among friends, you learn that strong leadership arises not from rigid control, but from understanding and support. A whispered word of encouragement, a willingness to listen, or an honest acknowledgement of vulnerability can create bonds that endure far longer than fear-driven compliance. Second, you see how personal wounds, left unattended, can metastasize into larger conflicts. Ferdinand's obsession was born of deep insecurity and lifelong trauma, By contrast, you are reminded of the power of addressing your own emotional scars through honest reflection, therapy, or simply sharing your story. In doing so, you prevent private pain from spilling over into your relationships or your work, safeguarding both your well-being and that of those around you. Third, the video highlights the peril of isolation. Ferdinand's final years were defined by secrecy, hidden holes in walls, clandestine councils, forbidden rituals. In today's always-on digital age, you're reminded to seek genuine connection rather than retreat into echo chambers or obsessive routines. Reach out when you feel anxious, admit when you don't have all the answers, and cultivate communities built on trust rather than suspicion. Ultimately, this story of a cursed line and a fractured kingdom offers a timeless warning: power without humanity becomes its own undoing. Yet within that warning lies hope. By practicing empathy, confronting our hidden wounds, and staying connected, we forge resilience stronger than any crown. If Ferdinand's reign teaches us anything, it's that true strength flows from understanding of ourselves, of others, and of the fragile bonds that hold communities together. So, as you close your eyes tonight, let these lessons settle into your dreams. A kingdom of compassion awaits in your own life, where empathy, openness, and shared humanity reign supreme.